A warm welcome to all of you and good evening. I'm Kathy Schultz, she, her, hers, Dean and Professor in the School of Education.
And I'm Ben Kirshner, he, him, his, Professor of Education in the Learning Sciences and Human Development Program area.
It is our pleasure to welcome you to our Ed Talks tonight, and I love that the chat is already active. Our theme is political courage, and we will be talking about powerful, personal, and political courage.
Tonight's talks, given by a group of professors in our School of Education, raise troubling and provocative questions that I imagine we will all think about well past this evening.
We are living and working in challenging times. These talks invite us to consider what it means to be courageous in our current moment. In particular, where do we find the strength to stand up to institutions that have failed us in the past and are continuing to fail us today? How do we persist when we encounter barriers to change and when our efforts are rebuffed? What is gained and what is lost when courage is required just to get through our everyday lives? These talks provide us with windows into the experiences the speakers have had at various moments in their lives, and they continue to stand up with integrity for what they believe.
Tonight's theme was inspired by Dean Schultz's observation that our school is full of brave teachers and scholars. This shows up in classes, in research, and in the ways these speakers have chosen to press for change in our institutions, including CU Boulder. I myself am continually inspired when I see the work that School of Education faculty do to challenge orthodoxies, speak up for human dignity, and imagine and enact more just worlds. I can't wait to hear from our 5 speakers tonight.
We invite you to listen to these talks through your own experiences and feelings and through the following questions. What does courage look and feel like in these talks?
Which people or groups of people are continuously called upon to resist the indignities and harms of our institutions?
And how do we gain courage from acting in solidarity with others?
How might you be inspired to be courageous in your everyday life?
Tonight, we have the rare opportunity to witness the dignity, vulnerability, and courage of our speakers as they give their talks.
Our first speaker, Dr. Joanna B. Mayes, is a proud first-generation college student from a family of artists, musicians, and social justice activists in Pueblo, Colorado. As the director of the Masters in Higher Education program, the interim director of the Multicultural Leadership Scholars Program, and an affiliate faculty member of the Department of Ethnic Studies, Joanna has been a fierce advocate, teacher, and mentor for historically excluded students for nearly 30 years. She embodies courage in her work as a scholar and teacher, and it's an honor for me to introduce her tonight. Please help me welcome Dr. Joanna Mayes.
Soy Chicana. I am not Latinx, and I am certainly not Hispanic. Soy Chicana. I come from the quintessential Chicano family, born and raised on the east side of Pueblo, Colorado in the 70s, where lowriders and other souped-up cars roam frequently around our blue-collar steelworker union town, jamming to the tunes of War, Santana, Miles Davis, Earth, Wind and Fire, Malo, Suavecito, mi linda. Our neighborhoods were clean and safe, and our Chicano neighbors became our extended relatives who would send home beans and chile to us in country crock butter containers, or as we would call it, Chicano Tupperware. Everyone in our neighborhood was fluent in Pueblo Spanglish, and you would hear it spoken in our corner grocery stores and meat markets. We took care of one another. We were proud Puebloans, proud Chicanos. My Chicano hippie family lives on the fringe. We don't like to color within the lines. My grandparents were proud ranch hands, farm workers, and restaurant owners. My parents, sisters, and cousins are visual artists, poets, jewelry makers, musicians, and social justice activists. You could see our Chicanismo in the strokes of our paintbrushes on a blank canvas, or in the vibrant turquoise and silver symbols we make and wear representing our indigenous ancestors from the Northern Cheyenne and Dene tribes. The women and the men in our family cooked our sabroso recipes, passed down from our Mexican and Spanish ancestors who have occupied southern Colorado for 6 generations. Yes, we didn't cross the border crossed us. Soy Chicana. I remember when I was 17, my dad and I ventured to a dark and seedy bar in my hometown to meet with an admissions counselor from CU Boulder, whose job was to recruit folks like me, low-income, first-generation college students. This Chicano counselor put the pen in my hand, and together we completed my daunting admissions and financial aid applications. He looked my dad in the eye and he says, "Don't worry, Gil, I'm going to take care of your hita." And he did, along with other numerous Chicano and Chicana educators during my academic career. As the first in my family to go to college, I arrived in Boulder in 1987, where the town was nearly 90% white, where many lived in multi-million-dollar houses, while our campus only had about 4% Hispanic students out of 25,000. I always remember the first day in one of my journalism classes where my white male professor plopped his books down on our desk and said to us, intending to be sarcastic and ironic, "Welcome to Boulder, the island of white privilege." His startling words taught me that I needed to become Hispanic in order to blend in to our super wealthy, lily white university. Yet I was a closet Chicana, only to my African American roommate, Carrie, who coddled my soul each night as we each curled up in our twin beds, munching on my mom's homemade salsa, while a rotating tabletop fan was on in our little dorm room constantly. We used that white noise to drown out the white noise, which were the sounds of the sorority girls who crowded our hallways in their constant privileged chatter about frat parties and going skiing on school days with their trust funds. Carrie and I talked about our social identities and how they didn't vibe at CU. It wasn't cool to be Chicana or African American on our campus. We stood out as the only brown and black faces in most of our classes. We did our best to act white to survive. Yes, survive, not thrive. But during my last 2 years in college, I found my Chicanisma. I was one of 4 leaders in our all-female Chicano student organization called MECHA, which stands for Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán. We were brown and loud and proud and brilliant. We upheld the student activism that our colleagues from Los Seis de Boulder began. We protested Linda Chavez and the English-only amendment. We protested the wars in Iran and Iraq. We protested in front of the chancellor's and president's offices, demanding that they divest in South African corporations that supported apartheid. But our biggest accomplishment was creating the very first Semana de la Chicana, a week-long symposium featuring Chicanas in the arts, education, law, politics, and business. I am proud to say that this event is still happening on our campus some 32 years later. But I couldn't wait to graduate and be away from the whiteness of our campus. The irony is that I graduated from CU, but later returned as a staff member and ran the very successful pre-collegiate development program. I left again to earn my PhD and became a part of the 8% of Chicanas nationally with PhDs. Then I returned again as a faculty member. With each time I set foot on our campus, I displayed more political courage and self-righteous power than I did before, especially when I became Dr. Mayes and became one of maybe a dozen Chicano faculty on our campus. I quickly realized that my sheer existence here was my resistance. My Chicanismo has been gifted to my Black, Brown, and Indigenous and Asian students I meet each day in my classroom, where I teach them about power, privilege, and oppression, the intricacies of critical race theory and counter-storytelling, or about the beauties of Chicana feminisms and the multi-layers of Chicano history and culture. I teach them that their own existence on our campus is their resistance. Over the past few years, I've realized that my students today have a new sense of political courage that I never had. Their political courage is now reaching the masses. My students, who are still mechistas y humaceros, who are multicultural leadership scholars, who are ethnic studies majors, are now calling themselves Chicanx or Latinx. They are marching in the streets for Black lives, for women's reproductive rights, for Indigenous rights. They're creating podcasts, websites, blogs. They're leaving their digital footprint to reach folks on the right and those who are right with their loud and proud and provocative messages of freedom, democracy, and equity for all. But back on our campus, I'm finding that more that things change for our Chicanx, Latinx, and Chicano students, the more they stay the same. As it was for Los Boulder students in the 70s, and with the mechistas in the 90s, today's Chicanx, Latinx students on our campus are plagued by those same feelings of isolation, marginalization, and racial battle fatigue because programs like the Multicultural Leadership Scholars, their homes away from home, are always on the chopping block to be cut. These students are working full-time and going to school full-time, deciding whether they should sleep or study each night. They are tired of fighting for their much-deserved financial aid or scholarships that were promised to them. They feel as if their professors or the administration does not understand that they are traveling on 2 to 3 buses a day to get to our campus. They feel like no one understands that they are caring for their little hermanitos back home while their parents are working the night shift. They feel like no one understands that they must send home the money from their student loan checks or the money they earned from their work-study jobs just so that their family could survive one more month. The more that things change, the more they stay the same. And yet what gives me hope is that while my institution and other predominantly white institutions have not changed, I see in my students the same fighting spirit that Los Boulder had in the 70s. I see my fighting spirit in them. It was passed down to them like the recycled Chicano Tupperware, filled with beans and chile and love, that will keep us grounded for one more day. I see proud Chicanx students who will not be silent. I see proud Latinx students who will resist. They are brown and proud and beautiful and brilliant. They exist. They resist. And they inspire me to keep fighting for one more day and to keep saying loud and proud, soy Chicana. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna, for showing up, resisting, and leading the way for so many of us. Our next speaker is Dr. Wendy Glenn. She is Professor of Literacy Studies and Chair of Secondary Humanities Teacher Licensure in our School of Education and was a Fulbright Scholar to Norway. Her research centers on young adult literature and how story can foster connection and invite disruption. She has worked as an English teacher in the Phoenix metro area, and we know that she's inspired so many future teachers here at Boulder and beyond. She inspires all of us on a daily basis with her generosity and commitment to justice. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Wendy Glenn.
kid, I remember feeling like I was in a perpetual state of moving, packing up our things, saying goodbye to friends made and then lost, wondering what the next new place would offer. When I ask my mom about this, she isn't able to pin down the exact number of these moves or the order in which they happened, as they often occurred within weeks or months of one another. People often assume that I grew up in a military family, but the reality is that my dad was the ultimate seeker of the alluring but elusive next best thing, despite the instability it created for his family. Money was elusive too, so we didn't have much to pack. But my little collection of books, acquired as birthday and holiday gifts over the years, always found its way into a box labeled Wendy. So regardless of where I was, Beverly Cleary's characters were right there with me. Ramona Quimby pedaled along Klickitat Street, getting into trouble with her best friend Henry Huggins and annoying her big sister Beezus. And Judy Blume's Margaret Simon navigated relationships with new friends in her new New Jersey town, wanting them to like her, but knowing her Jewish faith set her apart in ways that brought confusion and pride. I guess, for me, books were home, our home. They serve as placeholders in my memories, the geographies of self that I carried with me across the years and across state lines. I remember the nubby texture of the yellow and brown patterned carpet in our kitchen trailer as I sat with my back against the oven door, seeking warmth when I learned that Old Yeller had died. I remember the sunlight that streamed through our duplex window and lit up the pages as I entered the fantastical land of James and his giant peach. And I remember feeling independent as I sat in the green space at the end of the road, having traveled there by myself on my bike, reading about the glamorous adventures of Jessica and her twin sister Elizabeth at Sweet Valley High. So you can imagine how I felt when I got older and learned that adults wanted to deny kids access to many of the books that I held sacred. Would-be censors of James and the Giant Peach, for example, raised concerns about the tobacco and whiskey enjoyed by James's insect friends, the inclusion of the word ass, children disobeying authority, the promotion of communism, and the sexually suggestive nature of the spider licking her lips in anticipation of a meal. Those of us who feel deeply connected to story readily argue that literature can change lives. It can open us to new ways of thinking, it can affirm who we are, it can offer avenues for who we want to be. The irony is that censors use this same reasoning to justify their actions. Literature can change lives, they say. It can lead young people to question the beliefs taught in the home. It can invite disrespect, confusion, and rebellion. It can encourage risk-taking behaviors that are immoral and potentially destructive. Literature's power to invoke change, then, is a double-edged sword. Stories can cut and clear, creating new paths and ways of seeing, and stories can cut and concern, closing down these paths and creating insularity instead. As a scholar who has reviewed reports of censorship over the decades, I've learned several things. First, I've learned that censors seek to protect young people by eliminating their exposure to ideas that can create discomfort or guilt, worry or wondering. They want to keep kids for as long as possible. They go after books like Anne Frank's The Diary of a Young Girl, Bridge to Terabithia, and Charlotte's Web, deeming them unacceptable because they are sad. In Kittanning, Pennsylvania, a parent worked to eliminate Dragon Wings by Lawrence Yep from the 8th grade curriculum. Concerned that the book includes words like demon, dragon, and beast, she explained, if you have an impressionable 12 or 13-year-old and someone asks him if he wants to go to a cult meeting, he may be curious enough to go because he learned about it in school. I've learned too that censors want schools to be apolitical spaces. Holocaust stories, they argue, do not do any good and only tend to cause racial problems. And that instead, our children need to learn more about our founding fathers and our American heritage. This version of our heritage, however, should not include poems by African Americans about racism, as such titles reflect dishonor on the United States. When schools diversify their literature curricula, censors are quick to argue that the resulting stories don't belong in schools. In Erie, Illinois, the superintendent supported parents seeking to ban Todd Parr's The Family Book from the district's elementary schools because of a reference to same-sex parents. He claimed, "We're still going to teach tolerance, we're still going to teach diversity, but under no circumstances will topics involving alternative lifestyles be discussed at the elementary level. Our community has very clearly said that they would rather have those topics discussed at home." And I have learned that censorship is grounded in distrust of authors, librarians, and teachers. In Cheshire, Connecticut, 2 books were pulled from the curriculum at 4 elementary schools in response to parental objections to words like damn, Christ, hell, stupid, heck, crap, and shut up. A school board member supported the removal, arguing, "Remove this trash from our system, find out who put it there, and fire them." Obviously, this material was written by someone with a perverted mind. In reading literally hundreds of these cases, what I have really learned is that censorship is grounded in fear. Fear of change, fear of difference, fear of losing a world that one believes to be good and right and true. But facing our fears through story is ultimately a good thing. As a young reader who moved often, sometimes leaving a school after just 2 months, authors became some of my most trusted educators, teachers who exposed me to hard and essential lessons. Mildred Taylor introduced me to the Logans, a Black family living in Mississippi during the Great Depression. She asked me to think about what it meant for me to be poor, but white. Sandra Cisneros taught me beautiful words like abrazos, abuelita, and esperanza, and asked me to question why my school counselor in Arizona insisted that I study French instead. And Rosa Guy introduced me to a Black queer romance and showed me that love is love is love. Adults who, in the name of protection and preservation, labeled these books as dangerous gave in to fear, failing to see that pain and discomfort are necessary to the creation of better selves, a better world. Their censorial sword leans on the edge that cuts off, severs, disconnects. It shutters young people from a world that holds great beauty and promise in defense of suppression rather than liberation. Dominant narratives have historically and contemporarily perpetuated inequity and injustice, but dominant narratives are simply the stories we tell ourselves. Revision is possible. Literature can change lives, and readers with open access and open hearts can change the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy, for your moving words. Our next speaker is Dr. Susan Giroux. Susan is Professor of Learning Sciences and Human Development and the School of Education's first Associate Dean for Equity, Diversity, and Community Engagement. Susan is fiercely committed to understanding, uplifting, and leveraging community power for progressive social change. Her publications have focused on learning disciplinary content in schools, how practices travel in and across contexts, and the ways in which learning is a part of social movements for justice. I appreciate the wisdom, complexity, and moral clarity that Susan brings to her work. Please help me welcome Dr. Susan Giroux.
a colleague directly attacked my scholarly integrity, setting in motion an almost 2-year battle with my university. I had no choice. I had to fight back. I won the case, but I also lost. I lost years of my professional life, faith in the institution, and my original desire for being a faculty member. Power functions in brutal particulars. It stretches time. I was forced to return, rehash, and relive the past in order to defend myself. My senses were overwhelmed. My body ached. I was angry, disappointed, and righteously indignant all at once. Battling a powerful institution cracked me open. It broke parts of me and changed me. The case that cracked me open was initiated by an older white man who blamed me, a younger but more senior Indian American woman professor, for his professional failures. During those years, I was completely disoriented. By design or inefficiency, I'm not sure. I wasn't told, for example, what the case was about for 2 months. I repeatedly requested information and got no response. Throughout the case, I was advised by well-meaning veteran colleagues that if I were to just share the facts, everything would work out. As a woman of color, I had my doubts about this strategy. But as a social scientist, I too wanted to believe the facts would carry the day. What I found was that the faculty members on the university committees immediately aligned themselves with my colleague. Committee members took up my former colleague's allegations and complaints about me as their own. They repeated his harmful mischaracterizations in their comments and raised doubts about my integrity and expertise. They reinforced retrograde patriarchal beliefs when they questioned my role as a woman working with a man. Had I been kind enough to the complainant? Did I make sure that my male colleague knew how to complete basic academic tasks? They seemed untroubled that these questions positioned me as a subservient caretaker and the complainant as a person who was not capable of completing the work of a scholar. When I named these patterns of questioning as potentially racist and sexist, I got no response. I hired an attorney. For every day of my 2-year battle, I was made to feel enraged, frustrated, and tired. I was always screaming on the phone as my young daughter witnessed me trying to get the university to do something about my case. I obsessively replayed my arguments with my husband, who worried with me about how this would affect my livelihood and our lives. I couldn't sleep, and when I did, I would often jump out of the bed to run from phantoms. I was exhausted, but I refused to be beaten and positioned as an unethical, uncaring, and incompetent scholar. I flooded the committees with evidence responding to each and every feeble allegation set before me by the complainant. I responded quickly and thoroughly with carefully worded arguments backed by email records, Google documents with time-stamped entries, data visualizations, and letters from eyewitnesses to back every one of my claims. I produced hundreds of pages to defend myself. I was effective in forcing the committees to give up on particular lines of questioning, but they would come up with new and almost laughable angles to pursue. They kept shifting the ground. They would throw something at me, and I would quickly respond using all the skills of research that, ironically, I was being accused of not having. They tried to find the smallest of mistakes in my responses, as if to suggest that if I were capable of making a tiny error, I was also guilty of destroying a man's entire career. My unwillingness to be cowed made the committees more determined to win. When they threatened to level stronger accusations against me, which would have significant consequences on my career, I realized that what had sprung from one man's bruised ego had turned into a battle between me and the university committees who seemed determined to take up his cause. The case's increasing absurdity clarified that this was not about any supposed misconduct in which I was purported to have engaged in. It was about me, a woman and a person of color, challenging institutional power and those who hold it. When the case finally emerged from the bowels of the university and reached the highest level of review, it was fully dismissed. The nearly 2-year battle was an enormous waste of my time. It was a distraction that kept me from my students and my scholarship, my friends and my family. One of the especially damaging outcomes of institutional violence is that we are made to feel afraid to talk about how we were abused. We fear retaliation. We are ashamed that we let something like this happen to us. We worry about our careers. For many women of color, these fears are just another layer added to persistent feelings of not belonging in the academy. Our fears do not, however, silence us. Word gets out about who has been harmed, who has done the harm, and its consequences. I'm often contacted by women at conferences and via social media who need a witness to their story, who want advice, or who are at the end of their rope. I'm happy to talk with these people, but we should not have to rely on a whisper network to protect ourselves. I share my story because I want other women and people of color to know that they are not alone. What happened to me should not be understood as a one-off experience, a terrible thing that happened to an unfortunate person. While I was fighting with my university, I knew of 2 other women who were also in the midst of their battles. Comparing my situation to theirs underscored that not everyone can hire an attorney, draw on the strengths of their community, or continue fighting while maintaining their job. I have the gift of education, if not hyper-education, from a PhD to a postdoc to the privilege of a tenure-track position. I have the luxury of speaking the language of the academy, and I have access to a robust social network and economic resources. We should not be required to have all of these resources to stand up for our dignity. The institutions where we earn our paychecks were not created for people from non-dominant backgrounds to thrive. The procedures that enliven many institutions of higher education have not historically served us well. And there are people in our institutions who are threatened that we are here. I share my story with the hope that it moves those of us in positions of power, and all of us have some, to speak up, to intervene, and to challenge institutional abuse that often cloaks itself as legitimate policy. It is on us to recognize and embody our ethical responsibilities to each other. We do not need individual actors to save the day. We do not need saviors. What we need is collective responsibility and institutional accountability to ensure that abusive processes do not undermine the true and radical possibilities of higher education.
Thank you, Susan. I'm so inspired every day by your words and actions. Our next speaker is Dr. Valerie Otero. Valerie is a professor of physics education research. She's co-founder and executive director of the International Learning Assistant Alliance and a fellow of the American Physical Society. She has advised the National Academy of Sciences, the American Physical Society, and NASA on issues in education, and continues to work to find ways to highlight students' voices in the classroom. I am always impressed with how Valerie and her peer physics team support districts and teachers in bringing the joy of science to their students. Let's welcome Valerie.
I'm what is known as a physics education researcher. I study how people learn physics, why people don't learn physics, and I really just work to point out the consequences of what happens in and outside the science classroom. So I guess it really boils down to being an educational activist, somebody who tries to institute change in education. And activism requires a kind of a courage, which I define as taking matters in your own hands with the naive belief that it might make a difference. I actually became an educational activist in high school by accident. I went to a high school in New Mexico, which was mostly Hispanic, had about a 64% graduation rate, and most of the kids, like me, had parents who didn't get to go to college. I never thought much about that because I loved learning, and I was really good at math. I was the top of my pre-calculus class. I don't think I looked like the calculus student, though. I had big hair, I was a chola, chicana, and a heavy metal head. I think that the teachers noticed this also, because they would say things like, "You have to learn this to get a good job. Science is not for everybody." And I said, "Can't I just learn this because it's bitchin'? Because it's worth learning?" And it was then that I realized that there was a lack of respect for me, a human life, and what I might have to offer a discipline like a math or a science. And there was a lack of respect for those disciplines and what they could have to offer the quality of a human life. That narrative followed me, because later in high school, the career counselor came up and said, "We're going to help you. You're going to go to the career and technical education program so you could learn a skill to get a good job." I said, "Can I still take the calculus?" They said, "You won't need calculus, you'll take business math." And it took every bit of courage I had to say, "No, then I won't go." I had to advocate for myself, not even knowing if I could. You're not going to take me away from the one thing that I love. And it was then that I got this overwhelming feeling of empowerment, and I used to run around and tell everybody, "I'm going to be the leader of the revolution in education." Not really knowing what that meant, but knowing revolution meant change, and knowing that something had to change. I also figured I was going to have to figure out how to go to college, which wasn't that hard, because I had a lot of money saved up from working in my dad's grocery store for 30 hours a week since I was in middle school. So I majored in math, and I ultimately got a NASA minority scholarship. But it wasn't until my junior year that I realized I had to take a core course in science, and I end up in a physics class. Before that, I didn't even know what physics was. I thought I was going to be taking a class on the human body, but it turned out that it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It was like math with glitter on top. I remember describing it, and it answered so many questions that I always had, but it also allowed me to ask questions that I didn't even know people could ask. I loved it, and I changed my major to it, but I still felt a little ripped off that I'm a junior in college and this is the first I'm hearing of this stuff. And there was a professor who really believed in me. He told me, "You have to work in my lab. You got to get research experience. You have to work in my lab." And I said, "No can do. I work 30 hours a week at the grocery store." So he took matters in his own hands with the naive belief that it might make a difference, and he sent essentially an application for me to a research experience for undergraduates in San Diego. The next thing I knew, I had a bachelor's degree in physics in one hand and a plane ticket to San Diego in the other, and I was headed to the Institute of Geophysics and Planetary Physics to study research for 1 month. Well, when I was there, the minority recruiter for UCSD found me, and he said, "You got to go to grad school." I said, "Grad school? What's that? Didn't I just graduate?" He says, "No, you got to get a PhD." As a black man to a Hispanic woman, he said, "You're a part of the conspiracy. Unexpected people who can make a change. You got to go to grad school." And so we filled out the applications, and the next thing I know, I didn't leave in 1 month. I left 5 years later with a PhD in physics education research in one hand and a plane ticket to Colorado in the other to start my new job as a professor of physics education research at the University of Colorado, Boulder. One of the first things I did there was I taught this class called Physics for Elementary Teachers. And those elementary teachers, they taught me that the kids in the elementary schools were being denied access to science. And I thought, man, they're getting ripped off just like I was. And so we found a way to sneak it in the after-school program. We would have these students collect data and then use their own hearts and minds to try to explain the world around them. One of the activities, it had they would roll a car down a ramp and then they would measure the distance the car went. Then they'd increase the height of the ramp and measure the distance the car went. Essentially, these third graders were forming a mathematical relationship between ramp height and the distance the car traveled. They loved it, especially Jacqueline, there in the pink. She said, I've never done this before. And I said, well, you've probably played with cars and ramps. What you haven't done is systematically collected the data, written it down, and then try to use your own mind to make sense of it. It's science, it's physics. And with that, her face lit up with a new understanding. She said, you mean the tingles on the back of my neck can be gotten by rolling a car down a ramp and making sense of the world? I said, yes, it's learning, and it's your privilege. I did get this overwhelming sense that maybe I can make a difference. And so I got to work. And I began to work with elementary teachers, middle school teachers, high school teachers, and college professors to try to create learning environments to connect students' sense of self with those disciplines. Teaching students how to become expert learners rather than just expert knowers. And helping students learn to advocate for themselves through science rather than in spite of it. And it works. In our data, we're finding that students in these classes are saying things like, we used to be gullible before this class when the teacher just told us, but now evidence has our backs. And in some of our bilingual high schools where students are learning English the same time they're learning physics, we're finding that the non-native English-speaking women are outperforming everybody. Why? Because when you value sense-making over answer-making, you give more people an opportunity to show you just how much they can do. So we put this model in the universities, where undergraduate learning assistants, not teaching assistants, learning assistants, work on the instructional team with the lead faculty member to implement the course. They break down power structures so that more students have voice in their own academic affairs, and it works. In classes like calculus, chemistry, and physics that have high failure rates, we're finding that we're decreasing that failure rate by about 60% for students who've interacted with a learning assistant. And so the learning assistant model got the American Physical Society Award for Excellence in Physics Education. And I was recently elected fellow of the American Physical Society. And now I'm being asked to give talks all over the place to governors, to physicists, and all over the world. But the talk I remember the most was right on my own campus at CU Boulder for the I Have a Dream Foundation. The audience, it were elementary students, middle school students, and high school students that were just like me. Their backgrounds were so much like mine. They even looked like me. And I remember one girl in the first row, I could swear it was my cousin. But after my talk, that young lady that caught my eye came up to me. And she said, do you remember me? I'm Jacqueline. You taught me physics in 3rd grade. I said, how are you doing? She said, I just got accepted to college and I'm majoring in physics. And I said, of course you are, because that's what people like us do. In high school, I became an accidental activist. I found myself having to fight for the right, which really was a privilege, to learn for the sake of learning. And what I know now is that if you take matters in your own hands with the naive belief that you might make a difference, even in your own life, you might just end up making a difference in the lives of many. So now our programs are all over the world, which means that there's possibly a whole bunch of Jacquelines out there reminding us of the consequences of the messages that we give in and outside of the science classroom. Students who learn to advocate for themselves through evidence are in a better position to work their way through racism, sexism, anti-intellectualism, or any other form of oppression. They take matters in their own hands. They become the revolution in education. Thank you.
Valerie, thank you for your brilliance and your heart. Our final speaker this evening is Dr. Liz Meyer, a former high school teacher and currently associate professor in educational foundations, policy, and practice. Liz applies feminist and queer theoretical lenses to help educators and policymakers reimagine how gender and sexuality are taught and regulated in schools. She believes in the power of public education to envision and create a future where sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and white supremacy no longer exist, and works toward creating a more just and equitable world. I'm honored to welcome Dr. Liz Meyer.
My first memory of being bullied was in the 2nd grade. I was 7 and my family had just moved from Mississippi to Maryland and I hadn't made any friends yet, so I was often alone at recess. And a group of boys would follow me around chanting, "Lizzie's a lezzie." I didn't know what a lezzie was, but I knew it was something gross that made people laugh at you. I knew I didn't want to be a lezzie. At school, I learned gays and lesbians were disgusting, and teachers would not stop anti-gay name-calling because boys will be boys. A few years later, we moved to Texas, and I decided to try out for cheerleading. I made the 7th grade squad. On game days, we had to wear our uniforms to school, and you can imagine the puffy sleeves, the short skirt, and the bloomers. And I remember the boys coming up and rubbing their hands along my legs to see if I had shaved. I hadn't. And one boy loudly announced that I had hairy legs. I was humiliated. So I started shaving at age 12. At school, I learned my body was on display. Boys could touch me without my consent, and the teachers would do nothing because boys will be boys. The first time I fell in love, I was 19. I was working at a summer camp in New Hampshire, and I finally felt that spark. It was intense and amazing, and it felt so right. The only problem was that first love wasn't pure joy. It was also tainted with fear and shame because I was in love with a woman. In high school, I learned that gays were tragic figures dying of AIDS, and so I kept that secret for a year. I was terrified of losing friends and family, so I finished college early and ran away and moved in with her to a tiny 3rd-floor attic apartment in New Hampshire. That winter, we both taught skiing, and I cut ties with just about everyone to protect my secret. It worked for a while, but we didn't last. When I moved out that summer, I was relieved. I could go back to my normal life. So, in the summer of 1993, I was 21 and I got my first teaching job. I moved into another 3rd-floor attic apartment, but this time in a winter sports academy in upstate New York to teach French. There I was, back in high school, barely older than my students, and the harassment and homophobia was still there. Packs of hockey players roaming the hallways, grabbing the girls, cracking fag jokes, and drawing lewd pictures of me, graphic, sexual drawings. And the other teachers and coaches said nothing. Boys will be boys. This toxic culture is a form of gendered violence. What do I mean by gendered violence? It is any behavior that causes harm and uses heterosexuality, masculinity, and femininity to support male dominance and punish nonconformity. This includes anything from unwanted sexual comments or jokes to hazing on sports teams and homophobic name-calling, to the extreme end, which can include anti-gay violence, sexual assault, domestic abuse, and murders of trans women of color. Gendered violence is a tool of patriarchy and white supremacy, and it hurts everyone. It's affecting us all right now. It shapes our decisions about what we wear, how we talk, who we date, where we work, how we vote, and how safe we feel walking alone at night. Schools teach gender and sexuality through imposing gendered dress codes, hosting proms and homecoming dances that celebrate heterosexuality, only talking about reproduction and disease, and skipping over consent and LGBTQ identities in sex ed. By excluding transgender youth and ignoring or excusing bullying and harassment. School cultures reward only the most valued ways of being a boy or a girl and punish all others. At my first teaching job, I tried disrupting these behaviors. I even wrote a short article for a newsletter for gay and lesbian teachers. I wasn't out at school, but I felt I had to do something. So I wrote about informal supports for gay and lesbian students, and I identified myself as bisexual. That little article that was mailed in brown, unmarked envelopes to gay and lesbian teachers around the country found its way to my headmaster's desk. He called me into his office and showed it to me and said, "If you resign quietly, I'll find you a job at another school." What? No. I love my students. I love teaching. I don't want to leave. This isn't fair or right. So I refused to resign. There's no way they could fire me over this, right? Well, 1 week later, I got a 3-page letter from the school's lawyer saying my contract had been revoked and I needed to vacate the school apartment immediately after graduation the following week. I was shocked, distraught, astounded. Was this really happening? I cared about my students. How could they fire me for writing about supporting students? This moment changed me. I needed to find a way to make schools better. At school, I learned I couldn't be a queer teacher. So I moved out, regrouped, then spent a year in New York City becoming an activist. I attended the 25th anniversary of the Stonewall riots and joined the Lesbian Avengers. I marched, I danced, I learned, I protested, and I partied with proud dykes. And then I came to grad school at CU. It was the way I could get back into teaching. I certainly couldn't ask for a reference from the homophobic headmaster in New York. So I formally started studying gender and sexual diversity in schools in 1995. Since then, I have learned that teachers feel unsupported when they try to interrupt sexual harassment and homophobic jokes. Many want to address sexism, homophobia, and transphobia, but they don't know how or fear backlash if they do. I have learned that Don't Say Gay policies exist formally in 5 states and informally everywhere. We know these hostile school climates cause kids to harm themselves and avoid school. We know that boys who are bullies in elementary school are more likely to be homophobic harassers and rapists. We can't act surprised about sexual assaults on college campuses and anti-gay hate crimes or anti-trans laws when these are the lessons learned in schools. When I was in 2nd grade, I wish a teacher had stopped the name calling and introduced me to some nicer kids. In middle school, I wish the teachers would have educated those boys and made sure it never happened to anyone else. In high school, I wish I had learned something other than the tragedy of the AIDS crisis. As a teacher, I wish I could have been out to my students to show that queer people exist and deserve respect. I also wish that the coaches would have benched those hockey players and not laughed along with their jokes. I wish everyone would stop excusing sexual harassment and other harmful behaviors with shrugs and boys will be boys. I am every queer kid ever bullied at school. I am every young girl harassed in the hallways. I am every teacher silenced by intolerance. Educators and policymakers need to shore up their courage and step up to end gendered violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Your work and passion are vital, especially in these times as the lives of LGBTQ youth are being threatened on a daily basis. Now is the question and answer portion of our program. We have invited our fabulous speakers to join us on the screen. We've all been feeling your attention and care during the talks, and I've loved reading your wonderful comments in the chat. So this is always one of my favorite parts of the evening because we're live. So please write your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. Ben and I will take turns reading the questions for the speakers.
Our first question is, who in your life has inspired you to be courageous? Dr. Mayes, would you like to take this one? Dr. Mayes, you are muted.
Sorry about that. Thanks for this question. It's great to see everyone. Thanks to Dr. Ben Kirshner, who's been one of my greatest champions at CU. So I just want to acknowledge that. Who inspires me to be courageous? I must look at the folks who have come before me and acknowledge them because they've definitely paved the way for me. I'm acknowledging the strong women in my family who have lived tough lives and persevered beautifully and gracefully. I want to acknowledge my mother, my three beautiful sisters, but most of all, my grandmother, Dora, who was a farm worker in northern Colorado, and she had an elementary school education, and she taught me to be courageous and kind and empathetic all at the same time. I remember her telling me, I want you to have an indoor job at a desk so that I wouldn't be working out in the sun like she did her whole life. And so this 4'10" little lady taught me more about courage than anyone else in my life. But today, I think I want to acknowledge my students of color at CU because they teach me about courage every day. I see their power and determination as they struggle through our university. As the only ones who look like them in their classrooms, they're often misunderstood and undervalued in everything that they do. But they possess a different form of perseverance and courage that I rarely see in our world. Because, you know, they've endured different life-altering experiences at CU. When they finally graduate and leave our university, they're able to shine and thrive in their respective positions. And so they show me what the whole act of courage is all about. And so I learn more from them than I think I've learned from anyone. So.
Thank you, Joanna. So Wendy, your books bring back lots of great memories. What can we as parents, educators, or concerned citizens do to fight back when books are censored or threatened?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think I can probably speak to this best as an educator, since that's where my richest lived experiences are connected to censorship. And I would say that we as teachers can own our expertise and continue to select titles that reflect the identities of all students and all people. We know some stuff, right? And most significantly, we know our students. And coupled with that, I think we can also continue learning, especially when we're drawing upon titles that feature characters who hold identities other than our own. We can approach this work with humility and in community with others who know some stuff too. I think also as educators and also as parents, guardians, grandparents, tias, tios, et cetera, in the world, we can be advocates for young people's right to read in the school spaces that they inhabit. I always encourage our pre-service teachers to explore whether or not their schools and districts have policies in place that are designed to protect young people's right to read. And if they don't, fight for them, create them so that there are systems that don't allow an adult to never have read a book, but see the book that they're questioning, see a word on a page, blow up and decide that they want it out of school for every student within that school space. Yeah.
That's great. The next question that's coming in is for Susan. Susan, that was a powerful talk. This is a two-parter. How are you doing these days? And even though you are not calling on individual actors to move the needle, what can allies do to push institutions like ours and others to see and change the institutional violence?
Okay, it's just an easy one. How am I doing these days? It's not easy to recover from or to heal from institutional harm. It's an everyday process of like where I'm here. I took on a new position thanks to Kathy Schultz, our dean, who created an associate dean for diversity, equity, and community engagement. I find that really rewarding work. I get to work with people who are working to make the institution better. So I'm doing okay. What was the second part then?
It had to do with like, what can others do to push, or allies do to push institutions like ours and other institutions to see and change institutional violence?
Yeah, I think number one, I think that, and I will say this, like, I think white people in particular have an important role to play in predominantly white institutions, and they need to speak up. And like I said, they need to intervene, and they should listen to the people of color and the women in their spaces when they're saying that they're being harmed. And that means like, not just like waiting for it to happen and for them to like come to you to tell you you should do something, but to like go out and ask how people are doing, find the information, and then actually try to organize yourselves so that you can support people who are more institutionally vulnerable. And I think that there are a lot, I believe strongly in collective work. And I think there are a lot of collectives out there that are doing good work. And I feel like if you want to do this kind of work where it can be really impactful, you should join collectives like the Education Deans for Justice in Education, the EDGE Network, for example.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. I couldn't agree more, and words to live by. So this is for Valerie, and it's from Michelle and CEO. If you could go back and tell the little you something, what would it be? You're muted, Valerie.
Okay, the little me, if I was to be able to go back and tell the little me something, boy, difficult question. Again, I was very young when I realized that courage was necessary. And so I feel like I grew up kind of knowing this. One day when I was trying to buy, my mom was taking us to get these itsy bitsy donuts. I was only 7 years old, and she got 2 containers on our way out. It was the greatest day of my life. I took a bite of one of them and it didn't taste as good as usual. And then I looked at her and she said, "These donuts are sour. We're going back." And I said, no, we scored the donuts. Let's go home. She ended up returning them, and I was forlorn, but walking out, I realized you don't have to eat sour donuts. You don't have to eat sour donuts in life. And that's when I began, to think this was what I was told when I was a child. And that's when I began to realize and fight for every time I was getting fed sour donuts. And it happens every day. You saw the stories. You saw the stories that we have. And all we have to remember, not just me, but everybody, is you don't have to settle with sour donuts. You must return them.
Okay, this one is for Liz. This is from the chat from Steve Summer. You have all offered accounts of institutional and systemic frustration, and in fact, violence within academia. Yet you have both persevered and thrived in your respective fields. Beyond your incredible patience, what keeps you invested and not bowing out?
Well, for me, higher ed gave me the opportunity to stay engaged in K-12. I just kept getting pushed out of the K-12 classroom because of my queerness and my activism around queer justice. And so having higher ed as a space that allowed me to read and write and engage in theory and activism, and finally get tenure and to be able to do that with some protection is a huge honor and privilege. And yes, it's exhausting and frustrating and emotionally draining every day, but I can't imagine being given a better megaphone than being able to shape undergrads and future teachers and current practicing teachers and future scholars with our doctoral students. We just have the greatest gift of this community, and to be able to be educators. I feel like the institutions suck and the world we live in sucks. And this is a way for me to make it suck less.
So thank you, Liz. This is a question for Joanna, and it's from Crystal in the Q&A. Joanna, is your campus more diverse now?
No.
An additional question. We've not learned that not much has changed for the experiences of students of color. What do you want folks who say, but we've made so much progress, to know so they can help push for real change and progress in higher education?
Know that we're all fighting these battles within our respective classrooms, within our respective positions. The work, I hope in my lifetime, will end. I hope it'll end when I'm gone, where we don't have to worry about this. But our classrooms, our institutions are lacking in so much knowledge about historically excluded populations, why they're important, why they belong in our institutions. And I think we all just need to continue to embrace the classes that we are teaching, recognize the importance of these classes, and value the power that these students bring to our institutions. They are overlooked in our institutions, and they are powerful, and we need to hold these students higher than they are right now.
Wendy, how can we in the audience tonight fight censorship? How can we make these stories accessible, against these various threats?
I think there were some folks in the chat who were responding earlier with probably the most straightforward response, and that is to buy and share banned books widely, right? When you're purchasing those holiday and birthday gifts for your loved ones, with intention, seek out books that have been called into question by adults who want to deny kids access to the things that they should be allowed to read. So pretty straightforward response, but I think it's probably the most powerful thing that we can do as consumers, put our money behind the publication and wide dissemination of titles. Because we all know as soon as a book is named, challenged, or censored, it rockets to #1 on the bestseller list, right? People will buy the books that others have deemed inappropriate, in large part out of curiosity and out of advocacy. So many authors I know claim that the best thing that can happen to them is for their book to be challenged in schools, because kids find a way, they get access to those books. And I think we can fuel that process as adults in their lives by making sure that we get those books into their hands.
Thank you, Wendy. How, this really can be for anyone, or for Valerie, whoever wants to answer it. How has personal pain shaped your courage? Do you feel that you now understand courage differently?
I actually would like to respond to that one, but kind of in a roundabout way. So I feel like the courage, I agree with what's been going on in the chat and some of the discussion about how much oppression sucks and how real it is right now. But in my story that I told here, and lots of other things, obviously, that I wasn't able to tell, there were many opportunities when people gave me the red light, stop, you shouldn't. But there were also lots of places where they said, you can and must. And so a lot of the advancement for me was when people just believed in you. And so instead of it being a kind of a form of pain that set me forward, it was more the people that believed in you and propelled you forward. In fact, I sometimes call it the Buzz Lightyear effect. Sometimes you think you're just a toy, but then they believe in you so much that you can't help but fly. And so I think that that's the way I would respond to that. A lot of the courage and a lot of the things that come about, while pain is experienced in the process, so much of it is the kindness of others, and that people have made it their business to help you get a PhD or to tell you that there's something about research that you have to do. And there were so many white males that participated in my growth and development. And I'm just so thankful for all of the people who have promoted me.
We're getting just amazing questions through the chat and through other mechanisms, but it is now time for our last question. So we really just have time for one more question, and this one's for all of our panelists. I'm going to ask you to start, Liz. And then just to make it a little simpler, we'll go Liz, and then to Susan, and then to Val, then to Joanna and Wendy. So here it is. Going forward, what are the struggles that call for all of us to be courageous?
Well, it's the attacks on LGBTQ youth across the country right now, particularly trans youth, the laws and the legislation being proposed and advanced, and the battles happening over curriculum in schools are so real, and they really are life or death matters. And so for a lot of people, maybe they don't think that this affects them or their kids or their family. And so it does require the courage of everyone who cares about justice and equity and the lives of young people in your world to stand up and write letters and show up at school boards and vote for people who align with these values to make sure that we can shut this down. Because yeah, I'm an optimist. I mean, I said, yes, the world sucks right now, but I'm an educator because I believe we can make it better. And it will only get better if we all show up and try to make an effort in the local, state, and national context.
Right on.
I know I'm next, Ben. Thank you. I think the going forward, the challenge, okay, the struggles I think that as our institutions become more and more diverse, we're going to be required to be more courageous. And that means all of us have to be more courageous. And I think the greater diversity in terms of race and what all the things, right, are going to challenge us. And they're going to make us think in different ways. And we can't hold on to the old ways without really allowing and bringing in people and making new ways for things to happen. So I encourage us all to be open, to learn, to be generous, and also to fight for other people's voices and experiences to be included. Thanks.
Yeah,
Thank
just to restate essentially what Susan just said, but really, when we want to increase diversity, it's not just a matter of getting a different color of the same thing. What you're going to get when you increase diversity in any setting is you're going to get a different set of backgrounds. You're going to get people coming from the state fair, from the grocery store, like myself, and they're going to bring something new, like Susan was just kind of pointing out. And we have to re-understand what success means in these environments and how the new populations are changing where the edges of innovation are. And so I think for all of us, it's a matter of recognizing when there's sour donuts around, when we are not opening ourselves to new ways of understanding the world, and then taking action and doing something. And so I do think that courage is taking matters in your own hands with a naive belief that it might make a difference and going for it. And that is the ultimate courage to fight against injustice.
I'll go next. To me, it's recognizing and giving power to all immigrants. We are a nation of immigrants, and right now we are at a crossroads where certain immigrants are being given more power than others, or given more recognition. we need to recognize that all immigrants deserve to be here. They deserve the ability to have a quality education in our schools. They deserve to be treated equitably and with kindness and grace within our schools. Some of the best and brightest and most brilliant students I've ever had have been immigrants or children of immigrants. And I think we need to pay more attention to them and the power that they bring to our institutions.
Susan, were you raising your hand or no? Okay. Thank you, Joanna. Wendy, please bring it home.
Thanks. Yeah, I feel like we did not talk to one another, but there's a whole lot of resonance across all of our responses to this question. And I think that's fascinating. I think a significant struggle, and actually one that fuels some of the other struggles that we've talked about today, is divisiveness. I suspect we've all witnessed and perhaps experienced those moments of disagreement that result in the digging in of heels and the shutting down of conversation. But I believe deeply that with no conversation, no connection, no understanding, there's no opportunity for change, and that the gaps between us will just continue to grow. And I'm not saying we should abandon our values and beliefs in a show of compromise, but I do think it's important to remember that it takes courage to be quiet and to listen with care to the stories that others offer. And I believe that these stories matter, that the stories of individuals offer a path forward by making it impossible for us to rely on oversimplified narratives that position people as demons or sinners or enemies or whatever we want to call them. And sort of in line with what Joanna was saying, there is no one experience, and stories offer us nuance and insight and complexity.
Well, I'm just honestly feeling awe and gratitude to all of you. I'm so thankful to get to work with you and be your friends and colleagues and learn from you. In the chat, let's give a final round of appreciation for our speakers. And you can even, final round of appreciation for our speakers. Seeing a lot of appreciations in there. And I'm going to ask our speakers to say goodbye and turn off their cameras and mute. Thank you, speakers.
Thank you.
We also want to take a moment to acknowledge the many people who helped make these Ed Talks tonight possible. Andy O'Connor, our speaker coach and producer extraordinaire. Grace Maniscalco, who handled everything from logistics to the tech. Hannah Fletcher and Ichigo Takikawa, our amazing production, promotion, and communication team, who helped to put all of this together. And our wonderful videographer, Tom Harkin. Thank you.
And of course, those of you who have held space tonight for these amazing speakers and their stories. We are grateful for you, our audience and community, for coming this evening. We present these Ed Talks twice a year, and we look forward to inviting you to join us in person next fall. So we hope you find inspiration from tonight. Thank you so much. Be brave and good night.